She did not yet know that a single overheard word, spoken low behind a still-room door, would decide whose hand fed the Duchess her wine before winter, and she went on kneeling in the passage with the mended linen in her lap, because kneeling was safer than standing where she might be seen to listen. Verity Ash had learnt that trick young. Make yourself small. Make yourself busy. And the great house would walk past you the way it walked past a broom left leaning in a corner. Increase it, Cornelia Thorne said, so gently that a stranger might have mistaken it for tenderness. She must be settled before Michaelmas, one way or the other, and I will not have Sir Anthony arrive to find her strong enough to argue her own books. A boy's voice murmured something Verity could not catch, and a coin changed hands with the small flat sound coins make when they are not meant to be heard changing hands at all. Verity did not move until the door's shadow had gone from under it, and then she rose, and smoothed her apron, and told herself, as she had told herself 100 times since her mother died, that it was no business of a housemaid what medicines passed between a lady and her sister-in-law. She would remember, afterward, that she had believed that for exactly 4 more days. Everholt Hall in late August held its heat like a held breath, thick in the stone passages, worse in the sick-room, where the Dowager Duchess Eleanor lay propped on bolsters with a cough that had outlasted 2 winters and lately would not leave even in summer. The household had stopped saying she would recover and started saying carefully that she was comfortable, which everyone below stairs understood to mean the opposite. It was known, too, in the particular quiet way large houses know things, that the family's trustee, Sir Anthony Ray, had been written to and was expected at Michaelmas, some 6 weeks off, to sit down with the Duchess and go over the estate accounts she had lately found would not balance. 6 weeks. Verity did the accounting of it herself, without meaning to. It was a habit of a mind that had spent its whole life measuring dried leaf against fresh, drop against drop. Because her mother had taught her that the wrong quantity of anything kind could kill as surely as poison, and the right quantity of poison could sometimes heal. She carried the tea-tray up herself that afternoon, only because the upper maid had turned her ankle on the stair, and so it was Verity who set down the cup at the Duchess's elbow and saw, for the first time closely, the fine tremor in the older woman's hands, a tremor that did not match a cough at all, and the faint blue shadow at her lips that no chest complaint Verity's mother had ever named would put there. "You're new to this room," the Duchess said, not unkindly, studying her over the rim of the cup. "I am, Your Grace, Verity Ash. Ash, a plain name for someone with such a particular way of looking at my hands." Verity's own hands went still on the tray. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to stare." "You did mean to," Eleanor said, and there was, beneath the papery voice, something that might once have been a considerable wit, and I find I would rather be looked at properly than smiled at falsely, which is all the physician manages these days. Below stairs that evening, when Verity said, carefully to the housekeeper, that she thought the tremor in the Duchess's hands did not belong to a cough, she was laughed at, not unkindly, the way one laughs at a child who has announced she means to fly. Her mother told fortunes over a hedge in Wick End, someone said, not quite low enough, and the daughter would have us believe she's a physician now. Verity carried the empty tray back down without answering, because answering never once, in her whole life, had made a laughing-room stop laughing, and because some other part of her, the part her mother had built with years of patient teaching over drying racks and mortar and pestle, had already begun, quietly, to count backward from 6 weeks, and to wonder what exactly it was that Cornelia Thorne meant by increasing. She was sent for the next morning, not by the housekeeper, but by the Duke himself, which told her at once how serious the matter had been made to sound, because Julian Thorne, Duke of Everholt, did not send for housemaids. He stood at the window of his study with his back to the door when she came in, a tall, still figure against the light, and she noticed, before anything else, that his hands, folded behind him, were a working man's hands, scarred faintly across the knuckles, though his coat was cut for a duke. "You told Mrs. Pell, my mother's tremor does not come from her cough," he said, without turning. "I said I thought it did not, your grace." "On what authority?" "On my mother's, your grace, who kept a still room in Wick End for 30 years and taught me to read a pulse the way other girls are taught to read a hymn book." He turned then and studied her the way she had studied his mother's hands, and she made herself stand still under it, because stillness, her mother always said, cost nothing and gave nothing away. "My mother's own physician gives her until the first frost," Julian said. "Dr. Ferris is a careful man." "I am sure he is careful, your grace. I only wonder whether he has ever been wrong quietly, the way careful men sometimes are, without anyone troubling to tell him." Something moved behind his eyes, quickly suppressed, that might in another man have been the beginning of a smile. "You are very free with your wondering, for a housemaid. I have very little else that is mine to be free with." A silence held between them, not unfriendly, weighing. 3 days, he said at last. "You may bring whatever hedge remedy you please to her tea, 3 days only, and if she is worse by so much as a shade, you will leave this house without character and without argument. Do you accept those terms?" "I do, your grace." "Then we have a bargain. Miss Ashe." He did not offer his hand, which would have been improper, but he inclined his head as though she had been a man he was bargaining land with, and something in that small, exact courtesy stayed with her longer than any kindness would have. It was Mrs. Hodge, the cook, who found her crying with relief and fury both over the kitchen fire an hour later, and who did not laugh, being the one soul in that whole enormous house who had known Verity's mother by more than reputation. "Your mother physicked half of Wick End for nothing but a basket of eggs and a thank you, Mrs.," Hodge said, banging a pot down with more force than the pot required, "and they let her die in a fever with the door barred against her, because some fool said the fever was her own doing. I'll not stand by and watch her girl laughed out of a good place for the same foolishness. What do you need?" "Feverfew, if the garden has kept any past July, and something for the tremor, greywort, if there's any dried from spring. There's a jar of something grey in the far cupboard nobody's touched since your predecessor pickled onions in it. Go and look." Verity went and looked, and found, under a film of dust, exactly what she needed, and understood, holding the jar in both hands, that some doors in this house had been waiting to be opened by someone who knew what she was looking at. Cornelia Thorne received the news of the Duke's bargain with a smile so warm it took Verity a full day to notice it had not once reached her eyes. She was, by every account below stairs, a beautiful woman still, silvering handsomely, dressed always in grey silk pressed to a knife's edge, and she smoothed her cuffs, one and then the other, whenever she was thinking something she did not intend to say aloud. How resourceful, she said, finding Verity at the still-room bench, measuring dried leaf into muslin twists. "My sister-in-law has had physicians from as far as Bath, and here we are saved by a girl with a kitchen jar. You must forgive us if we are cautious, Miss Ashe. Households have been ruined before now by well-meaning girls with strange remedies, and I should hate for you to carry that weight at your age for the rest of your life. I mean her no harm, ma'am. Of course you don't. No one ever does. Cornelia's gaze dropped, briefly, to the muslin twists, to the small brown jar Verity kept capped at her elbow. And something in the dropped gaze had weight to it, though Verity could not yet have said what kind. Do be careful all the same. Grief makes fools of the kindest people, and I have buried a husband. I know what a house will forgive a widow, and what it will not forgive a girl who oversteps. It was said so gently that 3 of the upstairs maids, passing with folded linen, took it for motherly concern, and said so to each other in the passage, and a wager was got up in the servants' hall before supper on how many days Verity Ash would last. The odds running heavily against her, Verity heard the wager and said nothing, because she had already noticed something the wager-makers had not, that the Duchess's evening tonic came always from a locked rosewood case, to which only Cornelia held the key, poured always by Cornelia's own hand into tinted glass that hid its colour, and that the case, when she passed it on an errand, gave off beneath its lavender polish a faint, bitter, almond-sweet breath she did not recognise, and could not place, though her mother's teaching stirred at the smell like a hand laid on her shoulder. She wrote the smell down in her mind, the way her mother had taught her to write down anything that did not yet make sense, filed for a day it might. The Duchess, on Verity's tea and nothing else changed, was sleeping through the night by the second evening, and the tremor, while not gone, came later and lighter. Julian came to the sick-room on the 3rd night to see for himself, and stood a long while at the foot of the bed watching his mother breathe, evenly, without the catch that had marked every breath for a fortnight. "You've done this with feverfew and an onion jar," he said quietly to Verity, not quite believing it even as he said it. "With feverfew, greywort, and patience, your Grace." The onion jar was Mrs. Hodge's contribution. This won, for the first time, something that was almost a laugh from him, quickly swallowed, as though laughing were a debt he was not yet ready to pay. Verity noted it, and said nothing, but noted it all the same, the way she noted everything that might matter later. The bargain, once won, settled into something neither of them named. He came most evenings now to sit the last hour with his mother, and because Verity was always there measuring drops or steeping leaves, they fell, without deciding to, into a kind of shared watch, 2 people keeping the same small fire burning through the same long nights. It was over that shared work that the first true thaw came, not through any declared tenderness, but through the plain, unglamorous business of holding a basin steady while he held his mother's shoulders through a coughing spell, of handing him a cloth before he asked for it, of his handing her, in turn, the lamp so she might read a dosage by better light. "You watch the tonic case more than you watch your mother," Verity said one night, when the Duchess had finally slept, and the 2 of them sat either side of the cold hearth with the candle burned low. "Do I? You do, your Grace. Every evening, when your aunt brings it, your hand goes to the arm of your chair, as though you mean to rise and stop her, and then it doesn't." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had overstepped at last, paid for her freedom of wondering. "My brother Edmund used to say I watched everything and trusted nothing," he said finally. "He died 3 years ago this autumn, on a horse I dared him to take over a hedge he had no business taking, and I have watched a great many things very closely since, and trusted a great many fewer. That is not a fault, your Grace. It is, when it becomes the only shape a man knows how to love in. I decide, alone, what may be risked and by whom, and I have never once asked whether the person I was protecting wished to be protected in that particular coin. It was the nearest he had come to confessing anything, and she understood, without being told, that there was more behind it he was not yet prepared to lay down, a whole ledger of guarding and guarding still owed. "There is something you are watching for in that case, and have not said," she ventured. "There is," he admitted. "I cannot yet say what, only that I do not like the weight of the bottle when it is new against the weight of it when it is old, and I have never once been able to say why without sounding a fool. I would not think you a fool, Your Grace." "No," he said, looking at her properly for perhaps the first time since she had come into that house, "I begin to think you would not." Above the hearth a wren had built, absurdly, in the cold flue that summer, and its small song came thin and constant through the chimney brick at every dawn, so that the two of them, sitting up those nights, had come without remarking on it to listen for the bird before either spoke of parting for their beds, as though the wren's waking were the true end of the watch, not the clock. Verity found she listened for it now, the way she listened for her own mother's voice in memory, and did not examine too closely what that meant. The blow, when it came dressed as an accident, and that was the cruelty of it. Cornelia had watched 3 weeks of steady mending with a smile that never once slipped, and on the 4th Sunday, an hour after Verity's evening tea had gone down easily, the Duchess was seized by a spasm so violent that she could not draw breath for the length of 10 heartbeats. Her lips gone the deep blue-grey Verity had feared from the first, her pulse fluttering and then, terribly, slowing to almost nothing before it caught again. Dr. Ferris was sent for, and arrived white and furious, and it was Ferris, kneeling over his patient with his hand at her wrist, who found the empty muslin twist under the coverlet and held it up to the room like a verdict. Whose brew was this? "Mine," Verity said, "but it was the same brew as every night these 3 weeks, sir, unchanged, weighed the same, then explained to me," Ferris said, in the particular fury of a proud man made to feel a fool, why a harmless hedge tea should suddenly stop a woman's heart in her own bed, unless it was never harmless, and you have simply been fortunate until tonight. Cornelia, standing in the doorway with her hand at her own throat, in a fine imitation of horror, said, very softly, that she had feared this from the first, that she had said nothing because she did not wish to seem unkind to a well-meaning girl, that perhaps, and here her voice dropped further still, so that the whole room had to lean to catch the mercy in it, perhaps it would be safest, for everyone's sake, if Miss Ashe were simply relieved of her duties in this room, quietly, without blame, laid anywhere at all. It was the gentlest sentence Verity had ever heard passed on her, and it was, she understood even through her own fear, exactly calculated to sound like mercy while doing a killing thing. Julian came in at the worst of it, saw his mother grey and gasping, saw Ferris's face, saw the empty twist held up like evidence, and something in him that had been opening these 3 weeks closed again, hard and fast, the way a hand closes into a fist. "Leave the room," he said to Verity, not looking at her. "Your Grace, the dose has not changed. Someone has. Leave the room, Miss Ashe." He had never once used her surname alone, without the courtesy before it, and the bareness of it told her more than any raised voice could have. She left. She did not weep in the passage, though she wanted to. She stood very still against the cold stone, with her hands folded the way her mother had taught her, and told herself that fear was not proof of guilt, only proof of fear, and that somewhere in that sick room a bottle in a locked rosewood case had grown lighter than it ought, on exactly the night it mattered most. 3 days he kept her from the sick room, 3 days in which she was given menial work in the laundry, as though her hands, which had held his mother's pulse steady for 3 weeks, were now too dangerous to be trusted with anything finer than linen. It was on the 3rd day that Cornelia found her alone in the drying yard and, in a voice pitched for kindness, offered her a folded sum of money and a written character good enough to secure a place in another county, on the sole condition that she leave that same evening and speak to no one, ever, of tonics, or tremors, or the colour of glass. "You have been unlucky, not wicked," Cornelia said, pressing the folded notes toward her, "and I should hate for a girl with your evident gifts to be ruined over a misfortune that was never truly her doing. Take this, and begin again somewhere kinder. Why would you offer me kindness now, ma'am, when you offered me none in 3 weeks of doing my work well?" Something flickered, quick as a moth, behind Cornelia's composed eyes. "Because I am a practical woman, Miss Ashe, and I know the value of a thing settled quietly, before it costs more than it is worth. Then you will forgive me if I do not take payment for silence about something I have not yet been told I ought to be silent over." Cornelia's hand, holding the notes, did not shake, but her voice, when it came again, had lost its warmth entirely, gone flat and precise as a closing account. "You will regret refusing me." "I have regretted a great many things in my life, ma'am. I find I regret the taken bribes far longer than the honest refusals." She walked away with empty hands and a hollow stomach, having given up the only easy exit she would be offered, and did not know, walking, whether she had just been brave or simply a fool who could not afford the difference. That night, unable to sleep, she went, against every rule of the house, to stand outside the still room where the rosewood case was kept, and found the door unlatched, and within, in the case's narrow drawer beneath the vials, a loose board she had not noticed in 3 weeks of watching it from a distance. She lifted it with 2 fingers, more from the restlessness of a mind that could not rest than from any plan, and found beneath it a single folded page, close written, columns of figures and dates in a fine, immaculate hand she recognized at once as Cornelia's own, and beside certain dates, in the margin, a word she had never seen used as a heading in any account book in her life: dose. She had barely time to read the shape of it before a step sounded in the passage, and she thrust the page inside her bodice rather than lose it, and turned to find Cornelia, herself in the doorway, candle raised, smiling the smile that did not reach her eyes. "Caught at my private drawer," Cornelia said softly, in the dead of night. "How very like a thief." "I was not stealing, ma'am." "No," Cornelia agreed, "you were finding. Which is worse, because a thief only wants what is not hers, and a finder wants to be believed. By morning the whole house had it that Verity Ashe had been discovered ransacking Mrs. Thorne's private effects in the night, and a small dark vial of unfamiliar dried root, planted, though Verity could not yet prove it, in the pocket of her own apron while she slept, was produced before the Duke himself as evidence that the girl had been dosing the household with heaven, knew what for heaven knew what purpose. Julian did not shout. He was worse than shouting. He was still, entirely still, the stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and he looked at Verity across the width of his study, as though trying to remember why he had ever thought he knew her. "You will leave Everholt within the hour," he said, "and you will not come near my mother again. Your Grace, that page in her drawer, I have heard about the page. I have also heard, from 3 separate mouths, that you were found at midnight at a locked case that is not yours to open, with a vial in your pocket that no one can account for except you. I have given you every latitude a man in my place had no business giving a servant, Miss Ashe, and I find I am tired of being made a fool of for it." "Then you have already decided," she said, very quietly, "and there is nothing I can say that will unsettle it." "No," he said, "there is not." She walked out of Everholt Hall an hour later in a rain that had started sometime in the night, and had not stopped, without character, without wages owed her collected, with nothing but the folded page still hidden against her skin, and the wren's thin song, absurdly, following her the length of the drive from the flue she could no longer hear, but somehow still imagined. She walked the whole distance to Wick End, with her feet raw, and her mind circling one question she could not silence: if she was wrong, if the page meant nothing, if she had simply thrown away the only good place she had ever held on the strength of her own suspicion, then who was left in that house to notice when the dose next changed? She was 3 miles from the village, past caring whether the rain reached her bones, when a boy on a pony overtook her on the road, breathless, sent by Mrs. Hodge, carrying a folded note that said only, "The apothecary's boy came asking after you an hour past your leaving," and he would not say why, only that he was afraid, and that you were to be found before Michaelmas or not at all. She met the apothecary's apprentice in the back room of Mrs. Hodge's sister's cottage 2 days later, a thin, frightened boy named Davy, who would not meet her eyes until she had promised him, twice, that whatever he said would not see him hanged for another's crime. "Mr. Sallow's had a standing order these 2 years," he said at last, turning his cap in his hands, dusk-bell route, ground fine, delivered quiet to the kitchen door of an evening, and paid for not from the house account but from Mrs. Thorne's own purse, in coin, every time, so there'd be no line in any book to show it. "I never thought on it much, sir. Miss, begging pardon, folk buy dusk-bell for the heart all the time. It's no strange thing in small measure." Only the measure kept growing, these last 2 months, and Sallow said nothing, only weighed what he was told to weigh. "Would you say so before a magistrate, Davy?" The boy went white. "Mr. Sallow'd turn me off without a character, miss, and where would I go then?" "You would go," said a voice from the doorway, low and even, "wherever an honest boy is owed a place, which I will see that you have, whatever comes of this." Julian stood in the frame of the low door, having come, Mrs. Hodge later admitted, on nothing more than her own message that the girl he had thrown into the rain might after all have been right, and the sight of him ducking under that cottage lintel in his good coat, patient as a man waiting to be forgiven, undid something in Verity's chest she had been holding shut for 2 days. "I read the page wrong to you before I read it at all," he said to her, once Davy had been sent, trembling with relief, to wait outside. "I decided, alone, what was true, the very fault I confessed to you not a month past, and I did it to the one person in that house who had never once lied to me. You were frightened for your mother, your Grace. I understand fear. That is generous of you. I am not sure I would be so generous, in your place. I have had a great deal of practice being generous to people who did not deserve it yet," she said. "My mother's whole trade was patience with people who would come round eventually or not at all. And I find the habit has stuck to me." He almost laughed at that, properly this time, and it cost him visibly less than the last one had. Dr. Ferris, sent for and shown the page and Davy's account together, went the colour of old paper and admitted, stiffly, that he had certified a decline he had never once thought to test against a poisoning, because no one had suggested to him that anyone in that house had reason to want the Duchess dead before Michaelmas, and reasons once suggested, are not easily unseen again. Sir Anthony arrives in 4 days, Julian said. We will not wait for him to find the truth by accident. We will show it to him ourselves, before every witness that matters, and let the account settle in the light where it belongs. Sir Anthony Ray came to Everholt Hall on the appointed Michaelmas morning to find, instead of a quiet review of household books over tea, the long dining hall arranged with chairs enough for every senior servant, the estate steward, Dr. Ferris, and, seated with visible unease near the door, Mr. Sallow the apothecary, sent for on a pretext of confirming an unrelated bill. Cornelia arrived last, in grey silk pressed to its usual perfection, smoothing one cuff and then the other as she took her seat, and if she felt the room's stillness turn toward her like a compass needle, she gave no sign of it beyond a smile that had, for the first time in Verity's knowledge of her, the faintest tremor at its edge. Sir Anthony, a spare, courteous man with a magistrate's patience for silence, opened the household books first, as expected, and found, exactly where Eleanor's own hand had marked them months before in pencil, 3 years of small regular sums drawn against no listed purpose, always in the same close hand. These entries, he said, are yours, Mrs. Thorne, household incidentals. Cornelia said smoothly. A great house has expenses too small to itemize. Then you will not object, Julian said to Mr. Sallow, confirming what incidentals a lady's private purse has been buying these 2 years. Sallow's composure, thin to begin with, did not survive Sir Anthony's first question. Put once, plainly without heat, who paid you for the Dusk Bell route delivered to this house, and in whose hand was the standing order written? He looked for a long moment at Cornelia, who did not look back at him, and something in that unreturned look seemed to decide him. Mrs. Thorne's, sir, always in coin, always after dark, and the order itself in her own writing, which I kept, being a careful man in my trade, in case anyone should ever ask me to account for it. He produced the paper from an inner pocket, and it matched, line for line, hand for hand, the page Verity had carried against her skin through 2 days of rain, and Sir Anthony read it aloud into a room gone utterly silent. The increasing weights, the increasing dates, the small chilling word doubled in the margin beside the final entries, increase, increase. Before Michaelmas, Cornelia's stillness broke then, not into anger, but into something older and sadder, her hands finally shaking as they had never shaken through weeks of watching another woman's tremor. My husband left Simon and me with debts and disgrace both, she said, to no one and everyone, and I watched Eleanor keep her rank and her comfort and her son's whole inheritance, while I kept accounts for a house that was never to be mine, or my boys', and I told myself, at first, only a little, only enough to buy time before the audit, never enough to. She stopped. I told myself a great many things, she finished, the way I taught you all to smooth a cuff so no one sees what the hand beneath it is doing. Julian's voice, when he spoke, held no triumph at all, only a tired, settled weight. You will go to the dower cottage at Marrow Bridge with an allowance sufficient to live honestly, and this room will carry no further word of what has been said today. For Simon's sake, who is innocent of it, and for my mother's, who has been hurt enough without a public scandal added to her wounds. That is not mercy to you, aunt. It is protection of everyone your choices did not ask permission to harm. Cornelia did not thank him. She only nodded, once, and went out through the same door she had entered last, smaller now than the room had ever seen her. It was in the garden 3 evenings later, with the Duchess mending visibly by the day, and the dusk bell tonic long since poured out and buried under the herb beds where nothing but rue would grow over it, that Julian found Verity kneeling among the last of the summer lavender, her hands, as ever, smelling of dried leaf and crushed stem. "Sir Anthony has closed the books," he said. "The estate is settled, my mother is safe, and Simon, who knew nothing of his mother's dosing though he wept for an hour when he learned it, has asked only to be given honest work here, which I mean to grant him. There is nothing left, Miss Ashe, that either of us is owed, or that either of us owes. No, Your Grace. Nothing left to settle. Then I find myself in the strange position," he said, turning the brim of his hat once in his working hands, "of a man who keeps his accounts settled in every ledger but one, and who does not wish that one settled at all, only opened, freely, between us, for as long as we both care to keep adding to it. Marry me, Verity, not because my mother owes you her life, and not because I owe you an apology I can never fully pay, but because you wish it, if you wish it. It is the only reason I will take. It is, I find, Your Grace, the only reason I would give." He laughed then, fully, the laugh she had first coaxed out of him over an onion jar of dried greywort. And above them, absurd and constant, a wren sang from the same cold flue it had claimed all summer, as though it had been waiting, too, for the account to close. The wedding, when it came in October, was small by the standards of a duke's house, held in the estate chapel with no more than 40 guests, Mrs. Hodge weeping openly through the whole of it, and loudly denying that she was weeping to anyone who asked. Eleanor stood for the whole ceremony unaided, her colour returned, her hands steady, and gave her new daughter a small locket that had been her own mother's, saying only that some inheritances were worth keeping honest. Simon Thorne took up honest work as under steward that winter, and, within the year, an honest wife from the village, and never once spoke his mother's name with anything but a grief he had earned no part of, and bore anyway. Dr. Ferris, humbled past his pride, spent that same winter learning, from Verity herself, to read a pulse the way her mother had taught her, and became, in time, the loudest advocate in 3 counties for the cunning women his profession had once dismissed. In Wick End, where Verity's mother had died behind a barred door because a village had called her witch instead of neighbour, Julian funded a physic garden and a free still-room in her memory, with her name carved plainly over the gate, so that no daughter of that village would ever again be laughed at for knowing what her hands were doing. Cornelia lived quietly at Marrow Bridge, visited once a year by a son who could not yet forgive her, and could not yet leave her wholly alone either, and grew, by all reports, a very fine garden of her own, in soil that asked nothing of her but patience. A year, almost to the day from the night Verity had first knelt outside a still-room door with mending in her lap, she stood outside another door in that same house, now her own, and heard through it her husband's low voice, telling his sleeping mother, in the particular tone of a man who has finally learned to say a thing aloud instead of guarding it alone, that he loved his wife more than he had ever thought his guarded heart had room to spend. Verity did not go in at once. She stood in the warm dark and listened, the way she had once listened for a threat, and found instead, at last, a home, and somewhere above her, thin and constant. A wren was already singing the day in before the sun had properly cleared the hedge, naming nothing, needing nothing named, simply glad, in its small plain way, to have been let stay. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself hoping, somewhere past the rain and the locked case, that the overlooked girl would be seen properly at last, then pull your chair a little nearer the fire, because there is always room here for one more. I keep a candle lit and a kettle on for exactly this kind of evening, and I would love to know in the comments which moment stayed with you longest, the wren in the flue, the refused bribe, or the page finally read aloud in the light. Stay a while longer if you can. Subscribe if you'd like to keep your seat warm for the next one. And go gently tonight with the people who never once got to smooth their own cuffs in front of you. You may not yet know everything their stillness was carrying. Sleep well, and be generous with the ones who have not yet come round.